Hi students, this video is about the notes on the characteristics of living things. And the very first characteristic that all living things have in common is that they're all made up of cells. All living things are made of cells. Sometimes those living things are unicellular, meaning that they're made up of one, that's where the uni comes from, or they might be multicellular. That would be things like people, plants, animals, funguses, etc. Unicellular things are all in themselves one whole cell, so the whole entire living thing is only one cell. That's like bacteria. Alright, cells are also the basic unit of life. We talked about atoms as units, the smallest units of matter. Cells are significantly bigger than atoms, but they're the smallest whole living thing. Nothing smaller than a cell can live all on its own. All cells are surrounded by a membrane or a barrier, and you're kind of familiar with this if you've ever looked at a hard-boiled egg. There's that thin film covering that goes all around the egg underneath the shell. That's a membrane. It's a protective layer. It keeps all the contents inside the cell without having random things come inside. It also allows water to pass through easily. The next characteristic about cells, they're specialized, meaning that they have specific jobs, specialized for specific functions. For example, you have all sorts of different types of cells in your body. Skin cells, hair cells, lung cells, blood cells, etc., etc. And each one of those might have a lot of the same ingredients, same components, but they don't look exactly the same. For example, a nerve cell is used to pass communications from your brain to all sorts of different parts of your body. And so because it's passing information, it's generally pretty long and skinny. It's a pretty bad drawing, but it's long and skinny because it's almost like they're set up to be a highway to pass information from one place in your body to the next. Whereas in a plant cells are stacked, and they're generally square-shaped. Because plants don't have skeletons, plant cells are square and rigid and stacked and have a really hard exterior. So that kind of gives it the strength that a human skeleton would. So related to this, so these specific functions, their shape of the form of the cell is related to their function. So it's not willy-nilly that they are shaped the way they are. It really helps them do what they're meant to do. Right, the second characteristic of all living things is that they sense and respond to changes. And really what they're sensing is called the stimulus. Anything that causes a reaction in a living organism or part of an organism. For example, if you are physically touched on your arm or on your shoulder, you might turn around and have a reaction. If you see light, your eyeballs will start to dilate. You're responding to that external stimulus. Temperature, if you enter a warm room, your body will start to regulate inside to make sure that you don't overheat. So some of these you might even realize that you're responding, but other times your body is responding without even knowing. So then the response is the reaction of a living thing to the stimulus. So examples of this might be blinking. If you have something come flying at your face, or maybe a piece of dust, you're blinking to get that away. Shivering is a reaction to, or a response to temperature. Hitting back if something comes flying towards you, that might be your initial response. So then homeostasis is the maintenance of a constant internal state in a changing environment. It involves the organism constantly responding to outside stimuli, or stimulus, many stimuli. So homeostasis is something that's constantly happening. You don't realize it, but your body is maintaining a certain set of internal characteristics for you to continue living. Things like regulating your temperature, things like digesting. You don't consciously do those, but they're all helpful for you or necessary for you to continue living on. Alright, the third characteristic that all living things share is that they all must reproduce, right? Every single species must have a way of reproducing. That's what sets living things apart from non-living things. Alright, sexual reproduction is simply that it comes from two parents, and the offspring share traits from both of those parents. So this happens in most animals, and some plants use this strategy of sexual reproduction. The advantage is that the offspring are diverse. Diverse meaning that they're not exactly the same as either parent. So, if one of the parents had a gene that wasn't particularly successful, it's possible that that gene would not be carried on to the offspring. So that's an advantage. If the parent had a bad gene, it would get phased out through generations. A disadvantage to sexual reproduction is that it costs a lot of energy, especially if you think about smaller individuals. It takes a lot of energy, plus, if you're a plant, it might be hard to find a mate. So that's another disadvantage, that you actually have to go out and find the other organism to have the reproduction. Alright, asexual reproduction, and I'm going to block these off so it's a little bit more clear which goes with which. Asexual reproduction is the opposite, where it only requires one parent. One parent produces offspring that are exactly identical to itself by dividing. So, essentially what happens is that a cell will grow larger over time, and once it hits a point when it's so large, it simply will divide into two separate smaller cells back to the original size. So this is not something that we see happen. It's not like people can reproduce this way, or plants. Some plants can, but people or animals cannot reproduce this way. It's generally happening in small, individual, unicellular organisms. An advantage to this is that you have the same genetics. So this offspring down here that I drew before and this offspring are exactly the same as this one that started. It's just like going to the copy machine and making an identical copy of another piece of paper, but in this case, it's an identical copy of a cell. So if this parent cell was successful, and it had a good set of genes that made it suitable for its environment, that might be good if it were to have an identical copy offspring. So same genetics, but also low energy cost. That's pretty beneficial as well. A disadvantage is that it also does have the same genetics. This is a little counterintuitive. How can it be an advantage and a disadvantage? It really depends on the environment where the cell or where the organism is living. Alright. The fourth characteristic that all living things share is that they all have DNA. DNA is a molecule that contains genetic information and is passed from parent to offspring. This term called heredity, so the passing of genetic traits from parent to offspring, whether going back to the reproduction, right? Whether you are a unicellular organism that divides through asexual reproduction, or if a parent goes through sexual reproduction, both of the cells that are being passed down to the new offspring have a copy of DNA. So genetic traits are passed on DNA during reproduction. So because of this, having DNA, species can evolve over time. There's certain instances where the DNA will mutate. So there's certain instances where the DNA will mutate, and we'll talk about what that means later, but essentially that just means a change to the DNA. So a gene might present itself differently on your body or on the organism to allow evolution over time with DNA. Alright, energy is the fifth characteristic of all living things. All living things require energy for tasks such as moving and making new cells. So anything that makes a living thing, like growing, reproducing, anything that you can think of, responding to the stimuli from up above before, all those things require energy. So your metabolism, which is a word you've probably heard before, but maybe never knew the definition, metabolism is all the chemical processes that occur in an organism that are converting chemical energy, like from food, into other forms of energy, usable energy that allows your body to move and perform homeostasis. So these things might include photosynthesis, right? Plants are consuming their energy from the sun, and respiration, which we're going to learn about more this week. So there's two basic strategies for acquiring energy. Producers, like plants, are doing photosynthesis. Consumers, like animals, are eating foods. So producers don't have to go anywhere. They're producing their own from the sun through the process of photosynthesis. Consumers are just doing that, consuming foods that they find around. Alright, and the sixth and final characteristic of all living things is that they all grow and develop. So growth meaning that they just get bigger. And they might get bigger. This kind of goes down here. There's two ways that an organism might get bigger. If it's a single-celled organism, the cell itself gets bigger and bigger. That's kind of what I drew before. It might start as smaller and then grow in size over time. Once it reaches a certain size, then it will divide into two cells. So that's one way of growing if you're a single-celled organism. But a multicellular organism, like a human, like a dog, would grow by increasing the number of cells that it has. So it would start off at birth with a certain number of cells, and then as it grows, those number of cells will increase. So that's about growing. Developing is changing in shape, changing its form, changing its behavior. As a human grows, it still has all of the same body parts, hands, fingers, eyes, etc. But over time, those body parts might be better used. You have better reflexes as you grow older. You have better vision as you grow older. You become faster as you grow older. So those are all pieces of your development.